Thank you, Mike, and thank you all so much. I'm very excited to be here. As Mike said, I'm currently a secondary literacy coach, and I'm going to use my experience working with teachers at my school and how we got started. And so that's what I want to focus on today is how do you get started? We heard from Dr. Shanahan some absolutely interesting perspective on the Common Core State Standards and some things that we should be thinking about as teachers. And so I'd like to suggest some ideas of how to take what's out there, what's we've heard about the Common Core Standards, and get started as we work with our students in our classes. I'm going to really focus on literacy and the standards, and to give you a little bit of background about where I see this in the larger context of the conversation about both literacy and the Common Core. I'll just kind of briefly mention that something that Dr. Shanahan mentioned earlier today is that we do realize that as you go up in the grade levels, the texts become increasingly complex and require specific and targeted instruction, not just general literacy strategies and skills. Also, students need, as Dr. Shanahan mentioned, and I'm citing his work here, instruction that's specific to the disciplines. And I'll get a little bit more specific about that in a second. And now we have the Common Core State Standards that require that students are attending to the norms and conventions of the disciplines without extremely clearly defining what that means and what that might look like. And so we're going to try and take some of that on today. What this idea of disciplinary literacy is, this attending to the norms and conventions of the disciplines is very heavily based on the work of Cheryl Geisler, and it's referred to as teaching on the diagonal. This is Mokonichi's take on it. And so if you've not heard of disciplinary literacy or teaching on the diagonal, I'm going to give you an example of what that might look like. So the goal with doing disciplinary literacy and hitting those Common Core State Standards is to teach in a way where you're simultaneously growing in your content knowledge and in what they refer to as the habits of thinking in the discipline. So I'll give you a pretty basic example in the English language arts, let's say. A very basic introductory thing to do would be to identify a symbol in a work of literature and to say, yes, this is a symbol. And so you're looking and you're identifying, that's a habit of thinking, right? A little bit of a basic one, and you're understanding the concept of a symbol. As you go on, you want to grow, of course, in both your thinking and your content. So you might be analyzing the author's use of rhetoric and its effect on the intended audience. So there, both the content's growing because you're learning more specifically about rhetoric and its intended effect on an audience. So you're analyzing audience, you're evaluating an author's work, and you're seeing what their intent is and their effect on their audience. And so that's a more complex habit of thinking, which is increasing the rigor for students. That's the general idea behind the teaching on the diagonal. So when I talk about the habits of thinking and the premise of disciplinary literacy, that's basically what I'm referring to, is that you're using the thinking and the construction of knowledge to get the content. It's not, we don't have to teach content anymore because there's no content specific in the standards. It's we're using the standards and the thinking required by those standards to access the content in the disciplines. So I thought I'd talk just briefly, because I know Dr. Shanahan asked for the composition of the group, and it looked like we're mostly English language arts teachers with a couple science and math and social studies teachers peppered in. So I thought I'd just take just a minute to do a little bit of background of what these habits of thinking look like in some of the disciplines. In mathematics, the focus there is on, there's 8 mathematical practice standards. And they run the gamut from creating arguments to really being able to persevere when faced with a difficult problem. And the goal of these standards in math is to really look at going deeper in the content. In the sciences, a major focus is on learning from text, not from teacher, which involves students interacting independently with the texts of the discipline and not hearing the lecture, as was also mentioned earlier. Also to recognize that there are complex processes and follow multi-step procedures. In social studies, again, the focus is to learn from the content, learn the content from the text and focus on the role of the author while reading across multiple sources. So if you think back to that diagonal image, instead of just learning content from one source, now you're asked to look at multiple perspectives and evaluate the authors and what their views on a topic might be to then synthesize to get to the content. Again, it's complex for students. And in the English language arts, a big focus is writing about text and not necessarily just writing reactions to text. And close reading, where students are able to independently complete an analysis of text. And these are basically, there's obviously a lot more to the Common Core State Standards, but when I look at the standards, these are the big ideas, in my view, about what each content area is focusing on. And then there's the big one that goes across all 4 disciplines, is this idea of argumentation, which I know tomorrow's conference will cover in more detail. But the ability to not only be able to create and support an argument, but to also be able to analyze another person's argument and to be able to defend your interpretation of that argument. And so that's where we are in this moment with the Common Core State Standards. I wanted to give you all a second. I know when I was listening to Dr. Shanahan, I had 100 ideas, and I wanted to just run them over to someone and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? So I wanted to just give you a second to sort of process that background information that I just gave you, and also a little bit of what we heard from this morning. And just think for a moment. I gave you a little spot on your handout so you can collect your thoughts. I'm a note taker. I need to jot things down to help me even come up with my ideas. And just to take a couple of minutes to select one of these questions, really any question that you might want to address at this moment. What might it take for you to successfully implement the Common Core in your own context? Which of the shifts are going to be the most challenging, the least? Where would you like to begin? What do you need to do to prepare? Or really, if you have a burning question, this is your time just to take a little bit of processing time, and then we'll come back together and move on with the presentations. Just take a couple minutes, answer, speak with the people around you to generate ideas as a group. Thank you all so much for taking the time to do that. I know taking a minute sometimes to process can help. I encourage you to continue this conversation on the back channel. And also, I would hope that if you've raised some questions or you have some burning ideas that you've come up with and I don't address them during this presentation, that you would stay back and ask questions after so you can get as many questions that you have addressed. I can tell you I kind of popped around the room a little bit, and one of the things that I heard was, but we have 30 kids in the room, and we have a lot to do, and who has the time to organize and take on all of these standards in a way in which they're going to be successful. And I can say that that's my goal today, is actually to give you not the answer, but an entry point into how to take this on. I'm all about, students need scaffolds. I think teachers need scaffolds. We need help too, because we have a lot to do in addition to implementation of the Common Core. And I think that I know the teachers that I work with, and I imagine a lot of you think these standards can do really good things for our kids, and we want to do them well. And I imagine that's why a lot of you are here, is so that you're able to implement them well. So I hope to give you 2 ideas and then something to chew on. So the first idea that I hope that you'll gain today is about writing objectives and creating tasks. And I know that this sounds very simple, but instead of writing objectives and then adding the Common Core standard to it, I'd like to suggest flipping that and breaking down the standards and then creating our instructional objectives, making sure that we hit not only the habits of thinking, but also the content required in our courses. Also really going to spend some time talking about the instruction then, and modeling, and not just providing models, which is a habit that I see a lot of teachers falling into, the teachers that I work with as a literacy coach. And then finally, I just want to get us thinking about assessment of process in addition to content. Assessing content is very important, but maybe we might want to start thinking about how we assess that content so that we're sure we're hitting on the habits of thinking as well. So the role of the objectives then, as I alluded to, it does sound very basic to be writing objectives that, we've been doing that for a very long time. But the goal here is to truly write objectives that are based on the standard, but also relate back to the habits of thinking. So really think about your verbs that you're using with your students. That's the challenge I present to the teachers when I'm coaching them, is what are you asking them to do? And a lot of times it falls back on that understand, right? Or summarize. And summarizing and understanding are okay, but what are the students actually doing? What are you doing as the teacher, and what are the students doing in order to gain the content? And I jokingly call this the ratio. At work, I say, what is your ratio of students learning 100% from you or 100% from text and other sources? So are you doing a 50-50 split where you're lecturing half the time and then students are learning from text half the time? What exactly is that ratio? And that's often a very challenging question for the teachers that I work with to answer, because I think they'd like to think that, you know, it's more student-centered, but a lot of the times they do tell me, well, I have to tell them because they won't read, or I have to tell them because, and fill in the blank. So again, I'm not suggesting you're gonna go, you know, tomorrow and switch your ratio, you know, 100% on the students, but just be aware of that and set little goals for yourself as a scaffold. And I found that that's been helpful to the teachers. And also just asking the questions, what are the standards asking the students to do? And then what are your objectives asking the students to do? And do these match? And I know that sounds basic as well, but really taking the time to look at which aspects of the standards am I hitting. I have a very close colleague, I'm very good friends with her. She thinks she's teaching like 6 standards a day. And I'm like, how do you do that? Because I feel like there are 15 standards within each of these Common Core standards. So really kind of looking at what exactly are you going to measure? What outcome will you see based on the standards? And so one of the things that I find helpful is to think about what it looks like when you're writing the objectives, how to take on these enormous standards and turn them into something that makes sense in your classroom for your students. So one of the things that I do with the teachers I coach is we'll take a standard. I put one up there from the science and technical subjects. Grades 9, 10 is to determine the central ideas or conclusions of a text, trace the text explanation or depiction of a complex process, phenomenon, or concept, and provide an accurate summary of the text. That's a lot to do in any given day, week, month, semester, depending on how you're going to take this on, depending on where your students are. Are they already proficient at summarizing in your discipline and so you can move on to some of the more complex ideas? Are they needing a little bit of extra help and maybe that's all you're going to do is determine the conclusions? It's going to depend on your students. But to unpack it, if you take a look at the verbs in the standard, each verb is then giving you something to do, something to teach, something for the students to do. So if you take that standard and break it down, first thing you have to do is determine the central ideas or conclusions of a text. That's a whole lesson sometimes, right? Again, depending on the level of your student and the level of the text that they're interacting with. Tracing the text explanation or depiction of a complex process is a second thing to do, right, within that standard. And then finally, providing an accurate summary of the text. So what does that look like when you're trying to teach content and not make it Article Tuesday? You know, at science class, we're going to read this article today because I want to meet the standard. How can you integrate it and incorporate it into what you're learning? So I took a look at an article that is in Science Today. The article is called "Microbes at Home in Your Gut May Also Be Influencing Your Brain." And so one of the things you might do as a science teacher to meet the objective of explaining how microbes function in a human system is to have students read this article and to have them then write a summary of the text, determine the conclusion regarding the role of microbes, and then explaining how the idea is developed. So what you've done there is you've taken the standard and then broken it down by focusing on the verbs. And each verb then giving you, I like to think of it as a to-do list. This is my to-do list. I might not do all of these things with this one article. I might not do all of these things with this one lesson or in this day. But I know that it's my list of things to do. These are the things I should be checking on, making sure that the students are able to do. And then you take your content and you see how to make sure the students are learning both the content and the process at the same time. This is no easy task. So one of the things I ask the teachers I work with to, just think about this at the beginning of the semester. Make a little map for yourself and help yourself to have something that you can rely back on, a map that you made, a scaffold. And I'm going to get to that in just a minute. It's called the Gradual Release of Responsibility Extended Model. If you're familiar with the gradual release, I've just added a little bit extra of a scaffold to break up a more complicated task. Another idea that I wanted just to touch on, it's a spot of a challenge for some of the teachers I work with, is they write objectives, they go through, they unpack the standard, and then they write objectives, and then they ask students to complete tasks that don't allow them then to meet that objective. So one of the ways that this is very obvious is also something Dr. Shanahan touched on today, is the example of text-based responses. You want your students to be able to complete a particular task, and then you might ask them a question that doesn't allow them to complete the task that you would like. So an example, a task that may or may not require a text-based response would be, which rhetorical device do you find the most convincing? You have to read something, you talk about a rhetorical device. They may use text evidence, they may not. They don't have to. So if you can try and create templates and tasks for students that require them to use the text, that also is a scaffold as a teacher. So one option would be, how does Patrick Henry's repeated use of rhetorical questions affect the tone of his speech? That requires students to go into the text. And I don't know about you all, but it takes me I was an English teacher before I became a coach, an extremely long time to come up with good writing prompts and writing tasks, and to really make sure that I'm hitting the standard I want, I'm getting the content I need, and now that I'm making sure that it ensures the use of text in the answer. So one of the things I've found invaluable, I don't know if any of you have heard of this, it's called the Literacy Design Collaborative. I put it on your handout as a resource. It's on the second page. What this group has done is they have created tasks and templates for these tasks for every content area for each type of writing you could possibly do. So there is a task for compare and contrast in science. There's a task for analysis in literature. There's a task for anything basically that you might need the students to do to align with the Common Core standards, they've created a template for. So I highly recommend that you go there and look at it. And that's actually where the second example of a response, a task that needs a text-based response comes from, is from the Literacy Design Collaborative. So they say, what conclusions does the author draw about the impact of human actions on CO2 levels? How does the author support this or these conclusions? So they're giving you a scaffold as a teacher. They're like sentence stems, and they're wonderful, and they're brilliant, and they're easy to use, and they're available, and they're free. So that's like the best part about it. And I will say I get good reviews from the teachers I coach that these are very, very helpful for them. But when we're thinking back about instruction and what this looks like, how do you break up these standards? How do you make it something that is good for your students and something that you can possibly do along with all that you're doing? So I thought I'd give you a chance to try it before, while you have support here and friends in your tables and in your teams. If you want to take a minute, on your handout I just have these standards written down for you, and I've just given you an opportunity to try and unpack them. See where the verbs are. I like to either circle the verbs or underline the verbs, and then that helps me break it up into the bullet points. And then think of something that you might teach and see what you might say an objective would be. And I know it's sometimes hard to think of really good objectives when you're away from your content and away from your classroom, but see what you can do, or work on one person at your table's idea. And just take like 5 to 10 minutes to do this and see if this is a scaffold that works for you as a teacher. Okay, so how are we doing? I heard from a lot of people that this is a challenging activity, and that's because it is. It's very challenging, and that's why if we are going to take on the Common Core standards and do them in a way that's different and not do what we've always done and not say that we're doing the new thing, right? We're gonna have to take the time to take these on and break them apart. One of the things that I think is helpful to remember is that you don't have to cover every single one of these in one day, in one lesson, in one unit even. What you want to do is just know that this is the standard your students are expected to meet by the end of 10th grade if it's a 9-10 standard, right? Or the end of 12th grade if it's an 11-12 standard. So what aspects of the standard are you going to take on? And how are you going to organize that so that you know later that you have to go back and get to the other stuff? You don't have to do it. It depends on your students. I can tell you, as I lead into our next idea here, I can tell you that a teacher that I worked with told me, I said to her, she told me that the high school students couldn't write in history, so that they're just not going to because they couldn't write. And I looked at her and I said, but they write all day long in English. They write all day long, like they know how to write. So what is it that you think they don't know how to do? And she was telling me, and I said, so how about we break that in half? And how about we do half of that and master that and then add to it, depending on the level of your student. I work in a school where many of our students over 35% are reading below the 6th grade level of our high school students. And so we do have a population that we have to consider when we're making plans for instruction. But I think the biggest thing the Common Core reminds me of is that it's never good enough to sit to like sort of check it off the list. We either need to increase the complexity of the text and do it again once they've mastered it, or we need to be keeping in mind, okay, I only really did half that standard, and I need to go on and make sure that I hit the whole standard with my students before I can say they've mastered it. But trying to take on even like one standard a lesson, I'll be very impressed by you, like very proud. If you can do that effectively. A lot of these standards are very challenging, and I think the reason that we break them up is to make sure that we hit all of it. Instead of, I don't know about you, but I was an English major, an English teacher, and so I thought I could like really support my argument that my lesson was good if I applied like 15 standards to it, and I was like, go me, I did like 15 standards this week, but I really didn't, and it took me a long time to realize that I needed to flip that, and I needed to break down the standard and then teach what that was asking, what those verbs were asking us to do, and not what I thought we were supposed to do, and then putting like the Illinois State Standard on it to make me feel like I'm doing something really good for my kids. So I encourage you to just, that this is something you should practice and that you should try and do. One of the points I'm planning to make later is that the Common Core State Standards require you to do individual and self-professional development. And I'll give you an example of that, and that might be something that you would want to do. I could tell you one of the teachers I work with, when I would ask him to do things like this, he would look at me like I was crazy and then try it because he's a really good sport. And then he would say, but now what do I do? How do I teach it? So I broke it apart. I'm confused. There's a lot here. I need another scaffold. So what we created was an extension of this gradual release of responsibility model. But I want to talk for just a second about the difference between modeling and providing models. Again, a former English teacher, you give students exemplar texts. You give students text to look at. If I want them to see what a really good, well-supported claim looks like, I'm going to give them an essay and ask them to read it and show them, right, this is done. But I may never have shown them how to do that. There's a teacher I work with. He's a brilliant writer. And he says, Paula, I do not know why my students won't write. I give them models. I help them. I'm like, okay, well, let me come in and let me see like if I can read the kids, what's going on. He put up in front of them like one of the most beautiful short stories I had ever seen in my entire life that he wrote. And so since he wrote it, he thought that, that was modeling for them. I was like, no, you have to do it in front of them so that they see this is messy. I'm like, how many drafts was this for you? 3, 4, 5? They think that you just put this on the paper and it's done. And then there's something wrong with them because they can't do it, and now they're super intimidated because you just happen to be a brilliant writer. And so he's like, oh, so he changed that, and he really adopted and held on to the gradual release of responsibility model. And he tells me this, he sends me emails. I worked with him for 2 years, and he still will send me emails afterwards. Anytime a lesson doesn't go well, he says it's because he skipped one of these 6 steps. So I don't know how familiar you all are, as some of you probably have reading specialist degrees in the crowd here. This is the model for teaching strategy instruction, right? For students, Pearson and Gallagher in 1983, is to do direct instruction to explain this is how you write a claim. And then the teacher models in front of the students, which is the huge aha moment we had, was you can't do that beautiful writing away from them. You have to do it in front of them. And then the students assist the teacher. There's time for some small group practice of the skill, and then some time for individual practice with reflection at the end. And here's my confession. I was terrible at the reflection part. So I was like, what do they need to reflect for? And then I since learned that if you ask really good reflective questions, the students gain a great deal from being able to reflect on their learning. And so I have an example of this for you as well. But what I found with those standards, it's impossible to just apply this gradual release of responsibility model as it is and then go forth and teach. So what I found that was necessary is called the extended gradual release of responsibility model. And if you look on the back of your handout, I'm going to be sort of talking through this example of how to use that. I'm going to set the stage for you here. And basically, if you use this extended gradual release It just requires that you think about each of the objectives in the unpacked standards. That's the only thing that differentiates it from the gradual release as it is. The steps are the same. The teaching is the same. It's just, this is a teacher scaffold. This is a teacher's best friend to get through this semester. If the standard, and this particular audience, this is actually one of the teachers I work with, this is her work. She's a 9th grade social studies teacher. They're striving writers. These students are placed in a class that's, it's a class for students who are striving, I'll put it that way, and that they're really working on developing their literacy skills while learning the content. And so the standard that she wanted to hit was to introduce precise claims, distinguish the claims from alternate or opposing claims, and create an organization that establishes clear relationships among the claims, counterclaims, reasons, and evidence, with students who sometimes had trouble writing sentences and summaries. So this was very challenging for her. This is something that frustrated her. And so, like a lot of times, unfortunately, when something frustrates us, we avoid it whenever possible. And she got to a point where she could no longer avoid it because it became part of the semester exam. And so she unpacked the standards. I do that same activity that I had you all do. I do with the teachers I work with, and we unpacked it. And we figured out that there was these component parts to that standard. What she determined was she could only, right now, at this moment, take on the tasks in purple. She can only take on to write claims on historical content and support claims with evidence from the text. That's what she felt comfortable doing. She felt that once the students mastered that she could go back and show them how to distinguish that from other claims, their claim from other claims. Now, if your students are able to write claims, you don't have to wait. You don't have to break that up. But she knew her students and what they had been given her. This was about October of the school year. And so what her goal was to take on the whole standard by the end of the semester. So I thought that was a pretty good goal, but I'm like, how in the world are we going to organize this so that we don't forget to go back and do all the pieces that we need to do? And so we made this chart, which you have there in your handout. And what it involved was breaking apart the purple parts. So we're even taking the standard that we broke apart and we're creating even smaller objectives, things that we could take on and handle and master. And then we created objectives, which then led this guide. So I'm going to give you a minute to read it so that I don't read it to you. The steps for the gradual release are along the left side there. And then each of the titles in the top row are her objectives. And this is how she took it on. And I'll give you a second to read that before I go on. So this helped her to organize her thinking around how she was going to teach this very complex, very complicated, possibly difficult to teach, right, skill to her students in a way that made sense. And I can tell you very happily, by the end of the semester, they had mastered the standard. And she actually surpassed her own goal. And they were using multiple sources and synthesizing that information and getting evidence from multiple places. And I actually was able to watch one of these, the middle lesson with the supporting the historical claims. The kids were so excited because they were able to take on the task. They were being challenged. Kids love to be challenged, but they were also being supported because she was showing them exactly what she expected and giving them immediate feedback. And they were able to, she put me to shame with the reflective questions she answered because, again, that was my downfall in the gradual release. And the students were telling her, and then telling later their English teachers, that it's different in social studies than it is in English, which she felt that was enormously successful for her. And so she continues to do this and use this extended gradual release. And I've asked other teachers to use this in their classes as well. And it's truly a scaffold for you as the teacher to organize how you're going to take that on so that you're sure you're hitting each part of it without completely overwhelming yourself and thinking that they have to master an entire standard with one text, which would be extremely difficult to do. And also, I just wanted to point out that this was not an add-on to her instruction. She did this in order to teach them the content that they were studying. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Was this like over a period, over a couple days, or how was like the first thing, like she did this in one period? Or?
She did basically would be like 3 days for this one. And then as they got better at it, it got faster. So then we also found that once we got to this third, more complex level, she had to go back and do that one several times. It was very recursive, but it wasn't an add-on to her instruction. So I think at the time she was doing religions, and she was asking students questions about religions, and they were having to find the answers in the articles. So instead of a PowerPoint lecture that she had traditionally done, she told them what the claim was, and then they had to read the articles to support the claim in their groups after she had modeled that in front of them with a shorter piece of text. And so she appreciated it because she didn't feel like she was doing something extra, but she was able to meet her standards that she did. And I left a place for next steps here because you do have to consider you're not quite done with that standard. And every school is different with their scope and sequence and how they're aligned. But if you are expected to meet the standard and your students aren't quite ready, this is a scaffold for you to use so that you can remind yourself that you have to get back to that to-do list that you created when you unpacked those objectives. In order to use the extended gradual release of responsibility model, what you really need to do is just first of all identify your standard or objective and then figure out those skills. What are the verbs? What are those phrases? What is it that they're supposed to do? And then how will you use that for each skill? So just kind of like jot it down. How much do you need to break it up? And then map out your plan. And I always like to put like little notes to myself. I send myself calendar appointments now. I used to do Post-it notes, but now I do calendar appointments. Did you remember to? And then fill in the blank because you do have to get back to that and you're juggling 50,000 things as a teacher. And so you might actually forget that you were supposed to go back and make sure that they could differentiate their claims from opposing or alternate claims. And so mapping this in is really for you as a teacher to help you be successful. And also so that you don't have to feel like you have to be perfect at this or ready to do this immediately, that you're able to break it up and do it in a way that makes sense for you and for your students. I just wanted to give you an example of some more instructional considerations that teaching in this way or thinking about your curriculum in this way might help you to take on, and it sort of summarizes the points I've already made and adds one more point to it. I'm going to talk to you about an experience I had with a social studies teacher in my school. He's a phenomenal teacher and puts more effort into his teaching than most people I know combined. And he works extremely hard at what he does. And his students love him, which is always a good sign, right? And what we learned from this experience was, again, you have to model and not just provide models. And also, you may have to use some resources for individual professional development. And he just embraced it and just decided that he was going to do his own professional development on the things he was uncomfortable with. And it proved to be quite successful for him. So I'll set the stage for you. It's an 11th grade social studies class, striving readers and writers. He was trying to get them to this standard to assess the extent to which the reasoning and evidence in a text support the author's claims. So he wanted them to do this independently. It was part of his lesson on justification for war in general. And so he was asking them specifically to look at FDR's speech. To unpack that standard, he said it was to analyze the author's use of evidence, and then after you analyze it, evaluate the strength of the evidence used to support the claim in the text. So his objectives then became, because his objectives were broken up from his broken up standard, was give an FDR speech, analyze the evidence presented in the text, evaluate the evidence presented, and then write an argument that supports your position. The reason that he didn't really hit or use a standard to write an argument, that wasn't the standard he was focused on, is because that's not what he was assessing. He wasn't assessing their ability to argue. He just wanted them to have an argument. He was assessing that they could even analyze this evidence. So in his view, the standard that he could check off the list was just assess the extent to which the reasoning and evidence in a text supports the author's claim. He was tying it to his writing instruction, but that wasn't the focus of this particular lesson. So the task that he gave the students was to, after reading FDR's speech on the justification for war, determine which evidence was either his strongest or his weakest. He gave them a choice, and then provide justification for your argument. And so we mapped out this plan for the extended gradual release. We were really excited, and we had this whole thing going, and then between the time I met with him and the time he was supposed to teach it, life got in the way, and he just assigned it to them without giving them a model. So he gave them the speech and gave them the task and told them to go. And so this is what he got from one of his students, was that FDR's weakest argument is religion. FDR had 3 main points, and they were the following. Nazis abolishing all existing religions was one. Then also the FDR, which I like. said that the cross and all other symbols of religion are to be forbidden. Lastly, the FDR had written that they should place Hitler first, then God. This is not believable because there are too many people in the world to force this on. So he came to me, and he brought this to me, and he said that this was typical. This is just one example of a typical response. And he's like, I don't understand. What did I do wrong? This doesn't even make sense. And so we read it, and like 50 others just like this. And what we finally determined was that the students had written a summary. And so since they were just writing a summary, they didn't have to actually analyze anything because they were just providing a summary because they had not been asked to think in this way before in his particular class. So it was new for them. So he needed to show them how to do it. The issue was that he didn't quite know exactly the parts of the argument that he was asking them to look at. And he wasn't quite sure what an argument should look like. And so he realized this, and we sat down and we read the first 2 chapters, the introduction and the first 2 chapters of George Hillox's Teaching Argument Writing in grades 6 through 12. And we sat down and we looked at what the pieces of the argument were. And to him, he couldn't talk about someone else's argument because he didn't understand the terms to use that were required to write an argument. So this was a stumbling block for him, and it became this circular thing in his life where he would ask them to write an argument or evaluate someone's argument, and they weren't able to, and he felt it was because he was very uncomfortable as a social studies teacher teaching argumentation. And so, again, I told you, he puts a lot of effort into his work. He decided that he needed to create his own definitions, and so we sat there together, and these are the definitions we created, and he happily agreed to allow me to share these with you because he found it to be such a helpful part in his transition into implementing the Common Core. And once he came up with these, he went and retaught that to students. He told them what each of these pieces meant, and then he showed them how to find it in a work and then asked them to go back to FDR speech. Now, I'm going to give you the caveat that this student was not the same student as the example before, but this was pretty typical of what he got back. His after student sample, and I'll let you read it because I feel like I'm reading too much to you, but he was able to get this from his students. He now uses this as an instructional tool, not just for his students, but for himself. So he uses it to remind himself of what he's asking for, examples of these definitions, and what it is. And I'll tell you, he really embraced this idea of self-professional development and recognizing what his weaknesses were based on, he was a social studies teacher. I'm not sure that he had a class specifically in argumentation. And I think that's the case. I think I could point to like 4 or 5 things on the standards that I've never taught before and that I wasn't really taught myself. And so if you can identify any of those areas of discomfort and really embrace it, there are lots of resources available for you out there. I think everyone should have the George Hillox book personally because it's such a helpful resource, and really work towards your own self-professional development. And we're about to run out of time here, but I just want to throw this idea out there. I kind of knew I was going to run out of time before I got to it, but just to consider, how will you assess? So you've taken the standards, you've broken them down into manageable tasks based on the verbs, and then you've written objectives, maybe encompassing the entire standard, maybe not encompassing the entire standard, depending on where you are in the year and where your students are. How do you assess to make sure that they've met that standard? What type of assessment will you use? Will it be something that measures content and process? How hard will you have to work to match that task to the objective that you've written? If you are doing a writing task, again, I can't stress enough, the Literacy Design Collaborative is very helpful for that. And then how will you use that data to guide instruction? When you're making your map of your extended gradual release, maybe you didn't quite make the third column, and so you have to go back to it. How will you, as a teacher, what scaffolds and supports will you need and will you rely on so that you're able to then effectively ensure that the students have met the standard, the entire standard that they need to meet by the end of that grade band? So I just wanted to give you that to think about. Mike, do we have time for questions? Okay. So I'll take any questions that you all have before you go off into your inquiry groups. Mm-hmm.
In your 6 steps, reflection, can you give an example of adequate reflection? Is it a discussion? Is it another piece of writing?
You can choose to do it either way. I'm sorry, yes. She asked for reflection for the 6th step, for reflection on the gradual release of responsibility model. Could you do a discussion? Could you write? And you can do it any way that you choose. You can do a whole group discussion where you ask the question like the teacher did, reflect on the difference between claims in history and in English. It could be an exit ticket. It could be a journal activity. The students could have journals, or it could be a writing assignment in and of itself that you might grade. Yes?
A couple people at this table were worried about what happens when you're kind of committed to a text in your district or something. And I noticed that you pulled an article from a magazine for science. A lot of science texts don't necessarily talk about, alternative hypotheses and things like that, or the motivations behind the lab.
So are you
What do people do, if their texts are inadequate for these?
for the tasks? So I'm going to rephrase that question. So I essentially think what you're asking is, so yes, I have a standard. It's asking the students to be able to do something, but I'm given this text which does not allow for that. That, I think in history, people would run across that all the time, compare multiple authors' perspectives. If all you're using is a textbook, that's next to impossible. And so one of the recommendations I would make is to ask, how required is this? And this was always my trick as a teacher. I'm going to do your required text because I have to jump through that hoop. I understand I'm an employee of the district. Yes, I will do it. However, what can I add so that I can do that effectively? What am I able to bring in? And how much of this text is required? Is it required that I read all of the Crucible? Or could I read a section of it to really dig deeply into a point that's trying to be made so that then I have time to bring in some of these other texts? And so those are questions that I think are absolutely valid to bring up to either your department chair, your team leader, whomever you need to speak with to get curricular change. And you could even pose it as a question, like, how are we to do this? This task does not match the text that we are given to use. Any other questions? Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.